At 1:00 right now. Okay, great.
Yes, sir. All right, take it away there. Thank you for being here.
All right, blessings. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Bible study. We're getting near the end. In fact, I thought we were going to be finished with the Old Testament this week, but looks like we'll be another week, but that's good. I think what I'm going to share with you today, I trust you'll find enjoyable. Just kind of put context for those who join us and kind of come in midstream. We're doing a journey through the Bible, and we've been in the Old Testament now for a number of months with the Old Testament, and then we're going to move and spend several weeks talking about what happened between the Old and the New Testament. There is a whole nother empire, the Greek Empire, that we're going to be talking about. And then after that, we'll move into the New Testament. But let's kind of review what we did last week in the Old Testament. Last week, we talked about the rise of the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire went and they conquered the Assyrian Empire. And then they began to turn their attention as they continued to expand, as they started looking towards the Egyptian Empire there. But on their way to Egypt, they had to go through this small little kingdom called the Kingdom of Judah, or as we know, the Southern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom had been destroyed almost 100 years earlier, and now the Babylonians were taking their focus to look at the Judeans. We looked at the fact that Nebuchadnezzar came in 606 BC, and he subdued the people. He didn't destroy Jerusalem initially. He let Jerusalem continue to exist for another 20 years before eventually he destroys Jerusalem and the temple. But in 606 BC, he subdues the kingdom and he takes away some of the key people. And so we have our first people going into exile or deportation. And in that group was Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children. And so for the next 20 years, Judah is paying tribute to the Babylonians. The Judeans weren't always, the people of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, weren't always faithful, and they sometimes tried to rebel against the Babylonians. And on one occasion, Nebuchadnezzar came back to Jerusalem, and he took 10,000 Jews out of the city and the surrounding area, and he took it back to Babylon. The prophet Ezekiel was part of that deportation. Eventually, the kings who were subservient to the Babylonians, Zedekiah, the last of the kings, decided he did not want to pay tribute anymore to the Babylonians. At this point, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians have had their fill of these rebellious people, and so he comes in and he totally destroys the city of Jerusalem. He basically levels it, and he destroys the temple in the process. And he takes a third group of people out, and the prophet Jeremiah is part of that deportation. And so that's where we're at. For 20 years, from 606 to 586, Judah had continued to exist as a country or an empire. They had a king, but that king was a vassal king. He was subservient to the Babylonian king until they eventually destroyed, and the kingdom of Judah ceases to exist. Now, this launches us into a period we call the Babylonian captivity. There is no more Israel. There's no more northern kingdom. They had been destroyed 100 years earlier. There's no more southern kingdom. It has been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, eventually destroying the temple and the city. There's some key events or activities that happened during these 70 years of captivity that become important for the future of the Jews. One,
free rate update is completely free to use. Home value.
The name Jew was a term that sometimes is used in a very derogatory sense, but it didn't always have that negative meaning. The name Jew was originally applied just to those that were of the tribe of Judah. Then when the kingdom of Israel split and 10 tribes went with the northern kingdom and 2 tribes went with the southern kingdom, and that southern kingdom took its name from the tribe of Judah, it was called the kingdom of Judah. And so during that time, the word Jew covered anyone who was from that southern kingdom. But when the tribes lost their identity during the captivity of the Babylonians, the term Jew began to be applied to all those that were of the Jewish faith or of the Judaism. No longer was it just a narrow group, it was applied to all Jews. And so from that point forward to even today, when we use the word, we're talking about someone who's Jewish, we're referring to anyone who's of the Jewish persuasion. The second thing that became important during this period was a group of people, the Samaritans, were beginning to grow. They actually had come about within 50 to 100 years earlier by an action that the Assyrians had done. The Assyrians had removed large amounts of Jews from the northern kingdom, and they repopulated the land with a bunch of foreigners. The offspring of the marriage between the local Jews and those foreigners, because they settled around Samaria, the city of Samaria, they began to be called the Samaritans. And so we see they become prominent during Jesus' day because the Jews of the South didn't like, they disdained this hybrid group called the Samaritans. The Samaritans were part Jewish, part Hebrew, and part some other foreign blood that had come into the land. This was all due to what the Assyrians had done. And so the Samaritans began to take a more prominent role in influence during the time of the captivity, because again, Judaism and Israel had lost its identity. It basically was in captivity. Probably one of the most important things that happened during this period of the captivity was that the synagogues were established. No more temple. There's no more place for people to go where they would worship God and they would focus on their religious background. And so the Jews recognized that we're in captivity, recognized they needed a place to congregate where they could keep their roots alive. They could keep their religious heritage alive. And while they did not have a temple to do sacrifices, they could meet together to talk about the Torah, to read the Torah, to learn from the Torah, and basically continue to be faithful to their religious heritage. This was not led by priests. This was led by a group of what we would call lay people, non-preachers or non-priests. We eventually will start calling them the Pharisees. These were people during this time that really wanted the people to continue to be true to their spiritual roots and their heritage. And so they began to have these gatherings that we now refer to as the synagogues. They became so influential during this period that later on, when the second temple is built, the synagogues continued to prosper. Why? Number one, most of the Jews were still living outside of Israel or the place of Jerusalem. And so they wanted to continue to keep their religious heritage. And second, the synagogues were not only a place of worship, but they were also a place of instruction for the next generation. In other words, it became kind of a school, a place where you send your children, particularly boys, but also girls, to go and continue their education in their religious studies about their heritage. And so the importance of the synagogue cannot be overstated, its importance, and it continues today. There's no temple in Jerusalem today. That was destroyed by the Romans. But the idea of synagogues, or in some areas they call them temples, but what they really are synagogues. They're place of worship, place to keep the literature, the Torah, the holy scriptures of the Hebrews alive, and their heritage. This all developed out of necessity because of the loss of the temple, and it occurred during this period. And these lay people eventually would be called the Pharisees that were instrumental in keeping this alive. The fourth change that occurred during the Babylonian captivity, as we refer to it, is that idolatry was cured. One of the major reasons why the captivity occurred in the first place was because it was a part of God's judgment on the people for their neglect of their worship to Jehovah and their chasing after other gods like the Baal gods. When they come back from captivity after 70 years, they never go back to idolatrous practices. This is one thing that the people actually get right. They don't go back. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is great, because their worship became a very ritualistic formality. And the prophet Malachi, which is the last book in our Old Testament, was written to address this dead worship. In other words, they were going through the motions. They were going to the new rebuilt temple, but they were doing as a way of just being religious, but they weren't passionate about it. They weren't serious in terms of their worship to Jehovah. So while idolatry was cured, there were some other issues that began to surface after the captivity. Finally, and another significant change, which kind of sets the foundation for the New Testament 400 years later, is because the people were in captivity, because they did not have the temple worship, because they kind of had lost their national identity and they wanted to keep it alive, there was a hunger within the heart of the people for a coming Messiah. In the prophets of the Old Testament, when the Messiah is referenced, it's pictured as someone who is going to come and is going to right all wrongs. It was a picture of hope for the people. And so while the people are in captivity, this hunger for needing hope began to grow. We need a Messiah, and we need him now. And so there began to become a cry among the people for a coming Messiah. Now, one of the tragedies, or I don't know if it's tragedy, maybe overstating the issue, but one of the issues that happened in this pursuit of the Messiah is they didn't see the Messiah as we now know Jesus, who came to basically change our lives. They were looking for a militaristic Messiah, a one who would come and overthrow whoever the ruling power was. So when Jesus comes and the disciples kind of get it figured out that you are the Messiah, and then he turns around and tells them, yeah, and I'm going to go to Jerusalem and be killed, the disciples don't know what to do with that, because Peter goes, wait, you're not going to die, Jesus. Why are you talking like that? You're the Messiah. You're the triumphant. You're going to lead us, and we're going to overthrow the Romans. This is the mindset of the Jews at that time, and even the disciples. And Jesus had to set him straight and says, that what you're just sharing is not of God. And he actually rebukes him for his lack of sensitivity, because he was seeing the Messiah in a way that majority of Jews saw it, as a triumphant king. And when they saw those suffering servant passages from like Isaiah 53 and other passages, they didn't see that as one and the same person. They saw that maybe as the nation being the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And in fact, if you talked with most rabbis today, they attribute this Isaiah 53 passage to the nation itself and the suffering that it has incurred. We see it, and of course, the New Testament sees Jesus as eventually going to be a triumphant king, but see him as the martyred suffering servant who dies because you and I need a savior to save us from our sinfulness. Those were the key changes that occurred during these 70 years. After about 45 years have passed, after Jerusalem has been destroyed, Babylon has been the empire. There becomes a new empire that rises to the surface, and that's the Persians. So in 540 BC, 586 is when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. So 46 years later, a king of Persia by the name of Cyrus the Great begins to lay siege to Babylon. They were from over the mountain range. There's a mountain range that separates Iraq and Iran today, and it separated the Babylonians from this emerging new empire that we eventually would call the Medes and the Persians, or we shorten it to just the Persian emperor. Cyrus the Great, his mother was Mede. Now, I pause here for a moment because the Medes are interesting people. They were not as militaristic as the Persians. They were more peaceful oriented people. They were very, we would call them spiritual people. There was a spiritual hunger, and there were lots of priests that worshiped a variety of gods and looking for the true God of the Medes. The wise men who came to Jesus were from this group of people called the Medes. So the group of people are from what we now know as northern Iran today, the Medes. The wise men came because they had been exposed to the Jews who were talking about a coming Messiah. And in fact, there were many nations besides the Jews that were looking for some type of coming person that would actually fix the world as they knew it. And so they had their own versions of a Messiah. And so this kind of feeds into, and I share that with you, is that Cyrus, his mother was Mede. He comes from an area that was very sensitive to and be open to the things the Jews were teaching regarding the coming Messiah. Well, back to Cyrus. He's laying siege to Babylon because he's also Persian. But Babylon had prepared. Babylon had built an incredible city. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar had done this big city. He had built the hanging gardens for his wife. He had built this incredible arch that was that had mosaics on it, beautiful deep blue. In fact, remnants of it are in the Louvre in Paris today. And he built incredible city walls. The walls were so thick, it's been said that you could have chariot races on top of the walls. That's how thick they were. And so when Cyrus laid siege, he knew he was in for a long battle because not only had the Babylonians built this fortified city, they had built the walls that went over the top of the river that flowed through the city. And so they had access to water, and they stored food that would last them for years. Well, Cyrus, realizing the taking of Babylon would take years, he says, I got to come up with another plan. And so he makes a plan to divert the Tigris River, which flowed under the walls of Babylon. While this is taking place, while Cyrus is on the outskirts dealing with the river, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar is throwing this incredible week-long party, banquet. And I'm sure there was lots of food and there was lots of drink, and they were not probably seeing very straight, but all of a sudden they become wide awake when they notice a hand writing words on the wall. The king immediately calls for his advisors, and Daniel comes and he says, what does this say? And Daniel gives to him the interpretation of what the hand was. And in a nutshell, was your kingdom is being taken from you at this moment. And that's exactly what was happening, because the water began to drop, because the river had been diverted. And so the Persian army was able to go under the city, capture it, kill the king, and basically take the city of Babylon without destroying it, which was a very rare feat in ancient times. Typically, you had to destroy the city to conquer it. In this case, because of the strategy that Cyrus used, he was able to capture Babylon intact and take the city. Now, it's interesting, Babylon continued to exist. In fact, we'll study this in a couple of weeks. Alexander the Great, when he dies, he dies in Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon. In other words, it continued to exist as a city. Eventually, it's going to get destroyed, but during this time, it's intact. So we know the exact date in which Babylon fell. It was October 14th, 539 BC. Here's a little picture of the famous arch. It's in black and white, so we don't see the rich blue hues of the artwork that's on this wall. This was the famous wall that Nebuchadnezzar built. And this is the picture of Cyrus entering the city after his army had captured the city. Tremendous event. Cyrus was a different type of king. Now, my wife believes it's because of his mother, and that she may be absolutely right, but he had a whole different approach. And the Persians in general had a whole different approach to dealing with their captives. The Assyrians, they were cruel. They were just downright cruel. They were the ISIS of their day. The Babylonians weren't quite as cruel, but they deported people. They removed people. Thousands and thousands of Jews were removed from the Jerusalem area when they conquered the southern kingdom. But Cyrus decided to do something different. He had a large population, hundreds of thousands of Jews that were living in his expanding empire. And he decides that rather than use fear to control the people, he was going to reward them. He was going to help them. And so what he does for the Jewish people, and Ezra records this, is he says, any of you may go to Jerusalem and Judah and build or rebuild the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. So he befriends, or he at least accommodates, the religious practices of those that he conquers, and realizing that he's got a very strategic, because we're going to find out that in the Persian Empire, the Jews had some very prominent positions like Daniel and Nehemiah. They're going to have very prominent positions in the empire. To appease them, he's going to let them go back and rebuild the temple. Now, when they go back, they're led by a man by the name of Zerubbabel. He leads about 50,000. Now, what's intriguing to me about that number is that that's larger than the number of people that have been left behind after basically the nation had been depopulated, as people have been taken out. Historians say that Judah, which would have been the surrounding area around Jerusalem, had about 30,000 people, and Jerusalem, which basically was just a ruin because it had been leveled to the ground, had only about 1,500 people when this large group of people returned to their homeland out of exile, 50,000. Now, I try to read between the lines when I read these stories, and I'm imagine here are a bunch of people, 30,000, 1,500 in Jerusalem. They've been there. They're living kind of in an impoverished environment. And here comes this big group of people who had been in captivity. They probably were wearing the dress of the Persians because they had been there, or the Babylonians. They had been in captivity for at least 2 generations, and they're coming back. This is the recipe for tension and conflict. People come back to their homeland. As I said, Zerubbabel led this first group that Cyrus allowed to return back to Jerusalem. And one of the first things he does is he lays the foundation for the rebuilt temple. Provisions had been provided by Cyrus along with the people, and so they begin the process of clearing the land because there's nothing but rubble there on the Temple Mount, and they begin to lay the foundation. When the foundation is laid, there are 2 diametrically opposed responses. Among the younger people, possibly the ones that had returned out of exile, there was incredible rejoicing. This was a major milestone in them being reestablished as a people, getting their own identity back. But Ezra, in talking about this event, says there was a group of people that were wailing. And he uses it in a negative way, not that they were rejoicing, but that they were wailing in anguish. We find out by reading between the lines and reading two other books that we're going to talk about in just a moment, that these were probably the old timers, the ones that possibly had stayed behind, and they had lived long enough that they remember the majestic temple of Solomon. Because when they saw the foundation laid, a realization hit these people. This temple is not going to be as grand and is not going to be as large as Solomon's temple. So instead of focusing on what they had, rejoicing that they were being reestablished, they were beginning to cry the blues on what they didn't have. And you know what? That is so typical of us. How many of us spend our time worrying about what we don't have, and we forget to thank God for what we do have? Our health is not as good as it once was, and so we bemoan the fact, and we complain, and yeah, we hurt. I get it. We hurt. We're getting old. Our bodies are aching. But do we take moments to thank God for what we do have? Of his mercy and his grace and his forgiveness and the health that we do have, even though it may be flawed and may not be totally the way it used to be. So the people basically are intimidated because not only is there this tension within the Jews themselves, but some of the local Samaritans get word back to Cyrus that says, we don't want this temple to be rebuilt. They're going to create problems for you because this is why it got destroyed approximately 50 years earlier. And so there was a pause on the part of Cyrus, but Cyrus goes back and has his scribes reread his edict, and he says, I cannot go back on my word. I said they could rebuild the temple. The temple can be rebuilt. Well, when word got back, that was great news, but the people had gotten preoccupied doing something else. They were rebuilding their own homes. And in fact, God's got to send a prophet, which we're going to look at just right now, Haggai, to speak to this very issue. The Jerusalem population is now not 1,500 anymore. It's 20,000. But the surrounding land, the harvests are not there. It's not an environment that's conducive for growing incredible crops. And so people were scratching out a living. And Haggai encourages them to consider their ways, encourages them to resume the rebuilding. And he says, you guys have misplaced your priority. Instead of, if you look at the fourth bullet under Haggai, he says, instead of building the temple, you're building your own homes. And so you are not focusing on what you came back to do. You're focusing on your selfish reasons. So get your priorities straight. These economic conditions you're dealing with are not accidents of nature. They're there to teach you a spiritual lesson. I wonder how many of us see the COVID as an opportunity to teach us a spiritual lesson. I know one of the lessons I've learned is the value of relationships, the value of the community of believers coming together. And we're fortunate we still have technology that allows us to do it, but at best it's imperfect when we can't see people face to face like we did last year. And so there's always opportunities that God uses to teach us valuable lessons about ourselves and about our relationship with him. The final thought that Haggai shared is, to me, a just tremendous thought, because he's dealing with those old timers who were crying the blues because the temple was going to only be half the size and it was going to be built with scarred, broken materials. The rubble that was left around was used the building blocks because they couldn't afford to bring in brand new granite, brand new sandstone and cedar from Lebanon. And so he says to them, the greatness of this temple that you see, the second temple, is not based on its size or its grandeur, but it's based on the presence of God. And it's a valuable insight that Haggai gives to the people that is so true today. It's not about how big our churches are or how talented we are. It's about the presence of God that makes the difference. And that was the message. In fact, Haggai goes on to say that God himself is going to come and be in this temple. And in fact, this was the temple. It got remodeled by Herod, but this was the temple that Jesus himself enters when he's here on this earth. There's another prophet that parallels the same thinking of Haggai. He's Zechariah. It's exact same message. Hey, folks, we got to go back and finish the task before us. We have to complete the building, except he uses different phrases. He says, don't despise these meager or small or what appears to be inadequate beginnings, because it's not about the beginnings. It's about what God is going to do. So even though that temple looks small, don't despise it. God's going to do some great things, because it's not by might, it's not by power, but it's by the Spirit or the presence of God. The people eventually get the message and they go back and they finish the rebuilding of the temple. During the end of that finishing of rebuilding of the temple, another individual comes, Ezra. He had worked for Xerxes. He had been in the Persian Empire. We're going to find in just a moment, Nehemiah also had worked in the empire. These were influential Jews in strategic positions. And he leads a force of about 2,000 to 6,000 people back to help to finish the completion of the temple. The people had started, but they came back with resources to help finish the temple. The second thing that Ezra did was he began to try to get the house in order, the spiritual house in order. When the tabernacle, the portable temple, was constructed in the wilderness under Moses' leadership, it was determined that the Levites would be the people that would maintain and provide the services and the worship sacrifices in the temple area. Well, because the countries have been destroyed, people lost their family trees, so to speak. And so there were lots of people that were involved in worship in the temple that were not Levites. And Ezra wanted to get them back to the law, wanted to get them back to what was there from the beginning. And so he requires them to produce a family tree to demonstrate their Levites. And if they couldn't do it, they could not serve in the temple as priests anymore. The other thing that Ezra did is he began a huge campaign to get the people back to reading and hearing and studying the Torah. So Ezra has a very important part to transition the people from just coming out of captivity and building an edifice to beginning to get back to worship. But then we come to people that a lot of people know about, Nehemiah. He too served the Persian king, and he had the role of cupbearer. That also included being a food taster, because every king in ancient times was afraid of being poisoned. And so they typically would have a food taster there who would bring the food. And so the Bible calls him a cupbearer, but he probably also was a food taster. Well, he comes in one day and he's looking distraught. Now, that was a no-no. You never came into the presence of a king looking like you're carrying the world on your shoulders, but there must have been something special in the relationship between Xerxes and Nehemiah, so that he's able to ask the question and they enter into a dialogue. To make a long story short, Nehemiah has heard word that the people were still struggling and the walls of the city had not been built. If you don't have walls, you don't have a city. It's kind of like the argument that's going on in the country today. If you don't have a southern border, in other words, if anyone can come and go, you don't have a country. Well, that was the same logic that was going on back there. If you don't have a city wall, you really don't have a city. And that temple may not last, because there's lots of people who want to get rid of the temple. They don't want the Jews to resume their religious practices. And so he tells the king, and the king says, listen, take a small army, I'll give you some resources, and go and get it done. And so the book of Nehemiah is a great book about leadership. It's about planning. It's about delegating. And because of his strategy, they were able to rebuild the wall. Now, it may not have been a fancy wall because all they had was rubble to work with, but they rebuilt the wall so they were able to provide some level of protection. And they did it in 52 days. The scripture tells us it's an incredible feat, but it was great planning on Nehemiah's part. We've already talked about Malachi a little bit because of the worship. They had gotten rid of idol worship, but they had gone into this cold formalism. I remember, this reminds me of when I went to Finland one time. And when I would go to Finland, I usually would go for 2 or 3 weeks. And so I would be there over a Sunday. And so I found out who went to church, and I would go to church with them. And so there was this one peer that I worked with, and her husband would take me sightseeing throughout the countryside of Finland. And one day we were going and visiting one of the famed churches there in the capital of Helsinki. And I mentioned something because I had read in the little advertisements in the hotel room about the religious makeup of the country. And that it said that it's a Lutheran country. In other words, they have official religion. The religion is Lutheran. They have a state religion. But it says there that only 2% of the citizens attend church. And I was awestruck by that. That's a common characteristic of Europe in general. And so I said to her, I said, there's a difference between a biblical Christian and a cultural Christian. And she stopped. She wanted me to explore that because there was a real hunger in her heart. We spent quite a bit of time talking about Christianity and religious things. And so she wanted me to pursue that. And I said, a cultural Christian is a person who's Christian in name only. In other words, all of you, because you are citizens of Finland, by definition are Christians. But that doesn't mean you practice your faith. That doesn't mean that you have a relationship with the living God. We would call those biblical Christians. Well, that's exactly the issue Malachi is dealing with here, is that there was a cold formalism. If they did do the religious practices, there was no passion, there was no intensity, there was no focus on Jehovah as a God that had a relationship with his people. It was just something they did, if they did it at all, and they started drifting towards being what I called the cultural believers. And Malachi is to address that. The grandson, or the great-grandson of Cyrus, was Darius. And let's get to that. It was Darius. And it was during his time that the empire became its largest. The Babylonians basically had done about 2/3 of what we see here in the color code and to the west. But because of the Persians and their influence, they were able to go east almost to the Indian border in terms of their empire. At least 40% of the world's population probably were part of this empire, covered 2.1 million square miles. It was huge. One of the things that Darius did was he had a standing army, an army unit of the 10,000 that were highly trained. They were called the Immortals. And this became a common characteristic of future empires where they would start to have standing armies. He also had an imperial navy that was manned by these incredible shipbuilders and people that were just tremendous in terms of guiding ships over the Mediterranean Sea. He also created a spy network internally and externally called the eyes and ears of the king. So he knew exactly what was happening in his country because he had people reporting back to him what was happening there. In order to govern this large territory, he created 127 provinces, and he had them led by a title of satraps or satraps. Okay, that was the title of the leaders of these provinces. Daniel, who had been in the Babylonian, now was involved in the leadership of the Persian Empire. He is one of those satraps. The book of Daniel tells us about this experience. Well, we know from the Daniel story that many of the satraps were very jealous of Daniel. It could be because of his Jewish heritage. We don't know exactly why. They just wanted to get rid of him. And they found his weakness. They investigated, and they found the worst thing they could find about him was that he prayed too much. Would that be true of all of us? That the worst thing they could find out about our lives as they went through and combed the records and looked at our lives is that we pray too much. And so they decided they were going to lay a trap. And so they go to the king and they say, listen, king, you're a great king. There is no one like you. Your territory is vast. You are godlike to us. In fact, we think it would be appropriate that throughout the land, there should be an edict that says if anyone is going to pray, they need to pray to you because you are a benevolent king and you've done great things. I'm sure they just buttered him up, and I'm sure the king's soaking it up and everything else. And so he creates an edict that says if you're going to pray, the only person you could pray to was the king. Well, the trap was laid. They pulled Daniel in before the king and says, king, we find one of the first guilty parties, and we know what the punishment is. If they violate this edict, there is the death sentence that's upon them. Now, the king had a very special relationship with Daniel, and he's devastated this taking place. But the law of the land says when the king gave an edict, you could not undo it. You could not go back against it, even the king himself. And so he had to follow through. And so he throws Daniel into the lion's den. But he's awake all night because he realized he's done a terrible thing. So he gets up the next morning. I don't know what he was expecting, because surely all he's going to find is parts of Daniel strewed all over the lion den floor because the lions ate him alive. Except when he gets there, Daniel is still alive. And he says, oh, king, he says, God came down, my God came down, and he saved me, and he shut the lion's mouth. The king is ecstatic. And then he takes it out on Daniel's accusers, and he throws them into the lion's den. And at that point, the lions have a feast of a lifetime. That's the story of Daniel in the lion's den under the Persian king. Now, as we come to close to today's lesson, I want to end with this thought. The Greeks, who were a territory that were on the very fringe of the empire, were not a country. They were just a bunch of city-states like Athens and Sparta and Corinth and others. And they kept periodically wanting to revolt. They wanted to push off their oppressors. They didn't want to pay the tribute anymore to the Persians. And so Darius decided he's going to punish the Greeks for their revolting that takes place. And so he begins a series of wars against the Greeks. They weren't really smart because every battle they went to, they got defeated by the Greeks. The first one was the Battle of Marathon. Now, what we know about the Marathon was the marathon runner, the soldier who ran from the battle scene all the way to Athens, which was about a little over 26 miles. And that becomes the distance of the marathon that's in the Olympics today. It's based on a Greek soldier running back to let them know the outcome of the battle, that we've stopped the Persian invasion. Then 10 years later, there's the pass, and I can't pronounce it. I'll just say it's Thermale. This is if you've watched it, I haven't watched the whole thing. I've watched parts of it. It's pretty gruesome, pretty graphic. The 300. This is the Battle of the 300, where 300 Spartans go and they hold off the Persian invasion force long enough for the city-states to get an army together to eventually defeat them. And then the next two battles happened thereafter were battles that happened at sea. So over a period of 10 plus years, the Persians keep trying to subdue this rebellion city-states in Greece, and what we now call Greece, but they can't do it. Eventually, the Greeks are going to overthrow, and they're not going to forget, because these invasions that occurred, the Greeks were furious. Eventually, this is going to be the impetus and the motivation for Alexander the Great going east and destroying the Persian Empire, because once and for all, they did not want to deal with these incursions that were coming in to their territory. Final thought as we prepare for next week. Darius' son is a man by the name of Xerxes. He was continuing this tradition of trying to subdue the Greeks. And in order to get enough support, because the Persians had tired of going and getting their tails handed to them, he throws a large party. We'll talk more about it next week. He asks his wife, because he's now drunk, he asks his wife to come, and we don't know exactly what he wants her to do. Our imaginations can run wild, and she refuses him. Vashti is her name. She refuses him. He immediately gets rid of her, and he needs a queen. And next week we'll pick up, because this is where the story of Esther comes in, as we continue finishing up the Old Testament as we looked at the Persian Empire. As we close today, I'm reminded of God having strategic people at strategic times. Next week, we're going to talk about Esther. But today we looked at Daniel. We looked at Nehemiah and their roles that they played. We even look at a person who's not a believer, Cyrus, who God used as an instrument of his will to accomplish the return of the people back to his homeland. God uses people. Doesn't use them in terms of using them. He ministers through them. And my prayer for all of us, no matter what our age is, I know that we're retired, okay? But there's no retirement in the Bible. It's just we're going to do something, maybe not as much activity today, but that we still see that we have a role to play in God's kingdom. Just like he used Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel, Daniel, God wants to use you and me. Father, thank you for these lessons. Thank you for my friends. Keep them safe until we meet next week. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you all. Have a great, great day. And we'll see you next Thursday as we do Esther. And we wrap up the Old Testament.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you. Yes, very good.